Hello everyone, welcome to this episode of T-Shirt Driving. Today behind me, as you can see, is the Polestar wagon V60, and what we're going to be doing today is our amazing big brake install by Rotora. So here we are. First thing you have to do, obviously, jack the car up and remove the wheels. And with that, we're going to be doing one side, and you just do the same process on the other side. So enjoy. So after you've removed the wheels and lifted the car up, we're doing one side again. This is your traditional in your front yard style. The front is what appears to be pretty simple of just replacing everything, looking at the parts all laid out. Over here, you can see you've got your brake caliper, your bracket, your spring that's going to hold your pads in place through the top bridge. You've got your brake lines, you've got your hardware, and you've got your rotor. Very simple for our front setup. So the first thing you want to do is you want to unloosen this T50. I find it's easier to do while the car still has the whole assembly together. If it's being stubborn and the rotor wants to rotate and you're by yourself, you can add 2 bolts, or you're your lug bolts, and you can put a bar there to apply opposite force. If you have a friend nearby, you can have them apply the brakes while you unloosen all of them on all the car. We're gonna probably end up doing the bar method. I am by myself right now, so let's see how tight or how loose this is. So again, the first thing you want to do is loosen this up, making sure to apply pressure inside and just doing that like so. Not too bad. So again, this is just to hold the rotor in place. You want to save this because you will be reusing that. And now we can start working on the actual caliper and rotor assembly. So you have 2 10mm bolts that hold the caliper. Yes, you can go ahead and remove the actual bolts that are holding it with the bracket. I like to unloosen these. It just makes life a little bit easier for me. Yes, it's an extra step. 1 bolt. 2 bolts. Now the caliper and the rotor are kind of moving together. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to very slightly put that in, just to hold that in place for me while I move the caliper up and off. See, there we are. Now you can remove your rotor screw. And now the rotor will come off as well. Now the next thing to do is the brake line, because clearly the caliper won't just disappear by itself. We have to remove the brake line because we are replacing those anyways. Ooh, tons of rocks in the in your little splash guard there. So to remove the brake guide, there's a clip to pull out, and then we've got a threaded nut to unloosen and remove. You can go ahead and keep this one in, no worries on that. Let's bring you over here so you can see what I'm doing. So in here, these are your brake line holders. They just pop out, super easy. It's just a rubber grommet. Don't drop your caliper. And then we're going to be accessing this guy back here to remove that next. To make life a little easier, I'm going to get a bungee to hold our caliper up. It's not long enough. So what I'm doing with this bungee is it is going to hold the weight of the caliper, not the brake line. The brake line is still super loose, and the bungee is holding the caliper. So as you can see, there's no tension on the actual brake line. So now, rotor comes off, super easy, and you can see access to the original bracket for our system. So what I am doing with this, yes, this heat shield will work with our current brake setup, but because it's not even a heat shield, it's a dust shield, just to keep things clean, I'm going to remove it for my own purposes, for endurance racing. The times that I'm going to be posting, though, are more of a time attacks setup, So this is not going to have an effect being on or off the car to affect the track time at all, because it's going to be 1 to 2 hot laps, let it cool down, check my time, go out 1 to 2 hot laps, check my time. Nothing where heat soak is going to be detrimental on the rotor. So now we're going to loosen up these giant bolts in the rear. These are in fact an 18 millimeter. Sometimes the going backwards, righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. So I'm gonna pull this up. So I've got to move everything a little bit. Ooh, it's on there. It's moving. There goes my sound. Hopefully you're not just getting a shot of my knee. There we go. Let's loosen up the top. So if it's becoming really stubborn, obviously an impact gun that'll fit back there will work, or adding what I say is a cheater bar to your breaker bar to get a little bit of extra leverage or torque. As physics would determine, the longer your lever is, the more torque application you can apply. There it is. If you're having a tough time with these, heating them up, because there is Loctite, will be the key to removing those a lot easier. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove this dust shield for my preference. Heat shield removed. Now you can see there's a sensor here. I'm not too worried about that because, like our OEM setup, we have a sort of a floating disc, or the Rotora is a semi-floating disc design. So you've got those aluminum hats in the middle. It's not going to be generating heat. All the heat's going to be mainly up and around here, and it's be spinning and rotating. I'm not worried about that sensor. But yeah, let's remove that brake line and start to assemble our new setup. There is one thing I wanted to show, and that is the difference in the small height of our old setup versus our new setup. The OEM rotor, which you're looking at right now, is 371 millimeters from top to bottom. Our new Rotora rotor is 380 millimeters, and I can definitely tell it is slightly above. So if I turn this, you'll also notice the differences in the cooling channels and how we've got curvature, but they're much wider, much wider. And there is a slight height difference. Again, this is 380 versus 371, and it's just absolutely phenomenal with how this thing looks. And you can definitely tell, even on the inside, how this thing is just going to extract heat compared to the OEM setup, which I even have a rock in one of my vanes. I don't know if you guys could see that there, but there's definitely a rock in there. And these ones are giant and massive. Look at that. Pretty cool stuff. So we have to kind of assemble our rotor while it's off of the car first. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to be inserting the pads first by putting in our spring. This is going to allow there to be tension on the brake pads. Now, which way these go? Obviously, you keep the curvature with the curvature of the caliper. So the first one, you just push in, slide all the way back. Same thing over here. On the opposite side, you're going to push down get it on top of that. So if you're curious what I just did, you want to make sure it's on top of those two, not down here, but up here. And then you push down with your fingers, make sure they're seated in, and your brake pads are in. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the plug, and we're going to be putting in our brake line. So you want to put your copper washer in first. You're kind of making a sandwich. Put it through the brake line, and then your copper washer again. And these are crush style, so they will make a nice seal as you go and tighten them up on there. Might be a little tricky at first because the lines have been in a bag, so they want to naturally kind of curve. The other thing to note of importance is the angle right here. You want it sticking away from the caliper because, well, that's the angle of your line of how it's going to rotate. So this small little detail, make sure you pay attention to that as well. So we're going to make this hand tight. And I'm doing this first before trying to hook this end up to the car with the brake fluid, because any brake fluid that gets on any caliper or any paint finish has the potential to ruin it. So you want to try to keep things as clean as possible. So now what we want to do, again, you want this pointing up away from the bracket down below where the bleeder valves are at, because again, that is going to be the angle of how it's going to sit, is up, and then this is going to loop under like so. We want a slight angle about so. So not perfectly 180 degrees and not 90 degrees, but somewhere in that 45 degree range. And this you're going to roughly torque down to 14 foot-pounds of torque using a 13 millimeter wrench or socket. Yes, correction, it is a 14 millimeter. So just like so, I'm holding the line so it doesn't pivot or move, like that. And you'll kind of feel too, you don't want to overdo it, because if you do, it'll pivot and move. So you might want to counteract that a little bit, like that. Perfect. Click. 14 foot-pounds of torque. Not a whole lot. Even in the instruction guide it says do not use a torque wrench. And that's the angle you want. So now we are ready to go and hook this up to our brake assembly. And I've got our bolts here. Everything is packaged so nicely. I love the sound of freshly opening. And this process too is going to be very much similar to the rear setup. The only difference is going to be the orientation of that, and then hooking up the emergency brake, which you will see in a little bit. Alright, so now what we're going to do very quickly is remove our brake line. Again, it's being held up by a bungee cord attached to the springs. So the first thing I want to do, 13 millimeter, this is where I was confused with thinking 13 millimeter, is get that on, and I'm going to loosen this up. Righty tighty, lefty loosey. So I'm going to be pushing away from me on this one. Now I also have a pair of pliers next up, because next I have to, after loosening that like that, do one more turn, is grab this. There we go. So hold this up. There's that. This. Wiggle, wiggle, wiggle. Right on up. I can now grab the brake caliper and drop this down. Now remember, the brake caliper also is going to have brake fluid in it, so try to keep everything as far away as possible. Now you definitely can see the dripping. We're going to get the new setup. I'm going to change gloves. something that I'm going to do just to protect this a little bit, as I put this in some bubble wrap from packaging. Same thing, I'm going to hook in my bracket here, hold that up in place. That is so if this bangs on anything, nothing is going to get scratched. Now, this piece is going to come in through the top, like so, and then you are going to thread it in. That is a 17. Just like that. Now, the last part is clean up this brake fluid, because again, you don't want this. It's corrosive. So next up, we're gonna mount our caliper bracket right here using the same 18mm bolts. Those get torqued down to 70 foot-pounds of torque. Don't forget to add a little bit of Loctite as well. One last thing before we start putting the assembly together, if you do decide to keep the dust shield, you're gonna have to bend the bottom part a little bit just for some clearance, so that way it's not making contact with the rotor. Again, this is 70 foot-pounds of torque with a torque wrench. Now, if you've got bad corrosion here, you could clean this up. I've messed with this a little bit. I'm just going to give it a quick wipe, and my car is fairly new, so... And I've painted this inside already and cleaned this up before, so it's not too bad, honestly. But yeah, if you want to clean this up with a wire brush, you're welcome to do that, especially if it's really corroded. Now, what we've all been waiting for. Oh, that looks so good. All right, that's gonna go on as well. You've got your 50mm Torx right here. And this one, you're just gonna come in. This one wasn't incredibly tight, but you definitely wanna make it snug. All right, now the moment we've been waiting for as well, all these moments of waiting fors, we're gonna put our caliper on. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove it from our protective bag, and we are gonna put this baby on. So you remove that guy, slide you on, slide you on. There we go. Go with some little taps. Oh, there we are. And then when you're all done, go ahead and clean it up too, because there might be a little bit of residue or whatnot that may have gotten on it, or some dirt, all that good jazz. Car, you put in your rubber. There we are. A little stubborn, but that's all right. Washers first, on top, 1 and 2. Let me show you what I'm doing. So you can see the washer on there, and then the provided hardware or bolts. Alright, and that is how you install your front Rotora brakes. Oh my gosh, they look amazing. Don't forget to remove your bungee. and then you would have to bleed the system. Again, making sure the bleeders are on top because that's the way the air goes.